Hi, everyone. Before we get to today's episode of Jung in the World, I wanted to let you know that we at the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago have a bunch of new trainings and webinars open, including an online webinar with the guests of today's episode. If that sounds interesting to you, just go to jungchicago.org to learn more. Thanks.
There's a part of us that longs for what we think is annihilation, but is actually transcendence. It's ego death. It's not physical death. It's ego death.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host for Jung in the World. I'm honored today to have Connie Zweig, author and Jungian therapist, joining us to talk about shadow and shadow work. Connie has a PhD. She's a retired Jungian therapist, and she's the author of several books, including Meeting the Shadow, Romancing the Shadow, along with her award-winning book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, that extends shadow work into midlife and explores aging as a spiritual practice. She has her own podcast, and we will link to that in the show notes so you can find it easily. And she also has a Substack where she posts new articles, new research, and does live streams. Connie, welcome to Jung in the World.
Hi, Patricia. Really glad to be here.
Thank you. It's our pleasure. Believe you me, I have been looking forward to this. I have found that the longevity of your work, you've been writing about shadow and shadow work since the 90s, which is such a professional commitment. It makes me wonder, what was it of all of Carl Jung's theories? What was it about shadow that drew you in?
Yeah, that's a really important question, I think, for people to ask themselves, who are drawn to Jung. What's the hook for you? Where does your passion lie? And actually, Patricia, Meeting the Shadow, it was in the 80s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a collection of 65 essays by all kinds of thought leaders with Jungian backgrounds who really look at the whole landscape of shadow, from business and politics and relationships and creativity, how that particular theme affects every arena in our lives. And I collected that anthology with a colleague when I was in the publishing business. And it led me into Jungian analysis because there was this strong response. It resonated with people. There was not much other than Jung's work at that time. There was not much written for a popular audience on the shadow. And with the depth psychology, I mean, there was pop stuff, And my first dream with my first analyst was a dream about the shadow. And it was very formative for me to help me understand myself. And I continued reading Jung, but I was an early meditator. I had started TM when I was 19. And
Wow.
not for any holy reason, actually, but because I wanted to date someone who wouldn't date me unless I meditated. Isn't that funny?
That's an interesting criteria, though. You got to hand it to him.
Right.
Right.
He changed my life, not personally for long, but in that sense. And so I got very involved in meditation practice, and this was in Berkeley in the late 60s. And it kind of redirected me from politics into the inner world. And then eventually, after becoming a TM teacher, I began to encounter all the shadow in this community and with this teacher. There was lying and hypocrisy and kind of collective coercion to behave in certain ways and believe in certain ways. And so I left. I started to see that, and it became kind of intolerable for me. And I think that I was individuating out of the group. You know, Jung wrote about secret societies. And that community for me was transitional from my family of origin. It was like another family that in some ways was very positive, but then became unacceptable. And my individuation process just moved me on. And that's when I went to graduate school to study Jung and receive my doctorate. So this theme was kind of sticky. It was like sticking to my bones as I lived my life. And it wasn't really until I didn't write my doctoral dissertation on it. I wrote that on the holy longing, our yearning for transcendence, for the divine, for the archetypal world. And that arose out of that experience with the spiritual community and then became the book, which you didn't mention in the bio, Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path. So that became, it just became extremely vital to me to understand spirituality and shadow and how they could go hand in hand. So after I got my doctorate, I wrote Romancing the Shadow, which was more focused on relationships and on the method of shadow work that I developed in collaboration with another colleague. And that book also struck a chord because it gave people tools to explore where were these repetitive fights coming from? Why was I always choosing the wrong person? You know, how does my unconscious shape the reality of my relationships? And so that was in the 90s. And this theme was kind of following me around, you know, like the shadow does as we walk down the street. It was just kind of this invisible twin that was following me rather than my chasing it or pursuing it. It wasn't so much the ego's process. It was more like, this is what's showing up in my world. And as I could see shadow more and more in myself and in other people, it became more and more helpful and useful to me. I was in private practice for 30 years, and people came to me because of those books to do shadow work. So there again, kind of it pursued me. That's a long
Well,
answer.
no, but it's a great answer because it leads us to several paths that open up. And one of them is, I'm just curious, to be in private practice for 30 years and people are coming to you to do shadow work. I can only imagine the burden of that. I mean, this is what you showed up for. This is your career, but shadow work is not easy work. And I'm just curious how that over 30 years affected you as a practitioner.
Well, I continued to do spiritual practice. I continued to do psychological practice, you know, to take care of myself. I have a wonderful supportive marriage that's very much, we call it a shadow marriage because we really were able to do this work together over many decades and vow to honor and respect each other's shadow parts. So I felt like I could call on my own experience with clients. And I felt very kind of rooted in theory and in self-care.
Mhm.
And I loved them. I loved my clients. I don't know if every practitioner feels that way. There were only maybe one or two people who came to me over the years that I didn't have that intense affection for. And that really helped, you know. It helped with the bond, the attachment, the transference and countertransference. It helped with getting through the really painful traumatic issues. Sometimes I felt like I didn't have the tools I needed. Sometimes I needed supervision. But mostly I was thriving and I continued to write as well. So I think, for clinicians, finding your way of self-care, finding the ways that you take breaks from clinical work, finding the fit with the clients. There were some clients I didn't agree to work with because I felt like they'd be better off with someone else. Many clients can't do depth work with the unconscious, especially if they have serious personality disorders. There may not be a good fit, or active addiction. That's not a good fit for shadow work.
Why is that?
Why?
Yeah, I'm just say more about that.
Well, because when you start excavating unconscious material, you need to have a center. You need, I think, a consolidated ego and a foundation for facing these really difficult, unattractive, ugly, forbidden parts of yourself.
That's a great answer. Because I don't think we fully understand how something like an addiction alters the state of, our inner weather system.
Right.
Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense to me. You mentioned earlier, you use the term archetypal, and you write about this in your books that shadow is an archetypal concept, which means we all carry it. It's not necessarily driven by somebody experiencing a childhood trauma, but that might constellate something, a childhood trauma, but that we all just this is what we're born with. And so I'm curious, as you have worked with people doing shadow work over the years, it also strikes me that because it's inherent within us, it's in the unconscious, we can't look at it directly. And I think you say that in your book. You can't look at it directly, but it shows up either in patterns or symptoms or behaviors. And I want to talk a little bit about that. What are a few ways that a person can detect that now this is something from shadow that's arising in their lives?
Yeah. So we naturally and inevitably develop shadow right in tandem with ego development, because as the conscious personality develops, it rejects certain feelings, beliefs, behaviors that bring us disapproval or punishment or shame. And that's what builds the shadow, right? And so they're developing inevitably in tandem. And what happens is, and people have said to me, why not just leave it there? Why mess around?
Right.
What happens is it starts to erupt as we go through life. We see teenagers acting out and changing their appearance, to trigger their parents and their teachers, because some part of them is rejecting being nice, being good, right? We meet the shadow in our dreams. When we see a part of ourselves acting in a way that we would never do in waking life. But it's our dream. So it's a part of us. And I call it a shadow character. We meet the shadow in critical comments or sarcastic comments that we immediately feel humiliated by and want to take back. And that's not me. I didn't really mean that. We meet the shadow in behaviors that we can't control, like compulsions and addictions, this part of us that feels like it can't be tamed. That's a shadow character. We meet the shadow in moods that feel out of our control, like depression or anxiety or mood swings, in which an aspect of our unconscious erupts and kind of takes possession. It feels like it's possessing us. And then it's gone for apparently no reason. We meet the shadow in projection. We walk into a party and we don't know people are strangers, but we're immediately concluding who they are. Oh, that woman is so seductive, or that man is so aggressive, right? She's too old to be dressed like that, right? Or he's too greedy to want more money. So in projection, we unconsciously attribute something that we've denied or rejected in ourselves onto somebody else.
I just want to hover here for a minute because projection has always fascinated me. Typically because it's fraught with energy, meaning we really want to judge someone, we really want to castigate them, put them in their place, and deny usually how different they are from us. We would never do that, right? And so the sheer amount of force involved in most projections, it makes me curious about the inner workings of shadow, like the physics of it almost. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's always an exaggerated response.
Yes.
It's not mellow.
No, no, we're so righteous.
It has righteousness. And so, are those things that are forbidden or unacceptable to us in our shadows, in our personal shadows, are shaped by our family shadows. So the family also has a persona, and it also has secrets that it's hiding. And the community also has a persona. We belong to a progressive Jewish community or a conservative evangelical community. It has a persona and it has a shadow. And the country has a persona and it has a shadow. Jung wrote a lot about collective shadow. So all of these layers of life are building charge inside of us, inside of our projective shadow, our personal shadow. And what we see in the world today, in this moment, is intense shadow projection. If we look at every war throughout history and the wars we're doing today, if we look at racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, anti-trans, homophobia, anti-immigrant, all of these hatred and biases are rooted in shadow projection. And they're intense, as you say, because they have all of these layers in them. They're not just individual, right? They have all these levels of humanity built into them. And that's why today we can see how contagious they are.
Oh, yeah, they're cumulative.
I mean, if we look at human history of slavery and genocide, this is what's happened. So I feel, and part of this, I think, has brought up the current resurgence of interest in shadow.
Yes, it's everywhere.
Because
there are tropes on shadow all across the internet. And
So-
it's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, because you're the pro, you're the authority.
Well,
And I say so.
Can you be an authority on the shadow, really? I don't know.
Well, you've written several books, so.
But the early publishers of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow both came to me and said, let's do new editions because this is happening now.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's new writing and new editions in both of those books if people want like updated versions. And I think the younger generations are looking for this for a number of reasons.
Oh, tell me about that.
They're seeing there's a lot of trauma now and a lot of mental illness struggle in younger generations. And, because of the AMA and the sort of takeover of psychology and the lack of depth psychology in the popular culture, there's a lot of frustration, with brief therapy and CBT and drugs, right? Pharmaceuticals. So people are looking for an alternative now that teaches them how to be accountable, how to be self-reflective, how to really deal with their own issues, how to really deal with their partners so that they're not in the blame game of projection in their relationships. And I feel some hope about this. And also about meditation, which continues to be of interest to younger generations. Every time I teach shadow work, I teach meditation for that centering practice that we were talking about, right? So that people build a foundation to meet their shadow in all these ways. And I've been talking a lot about this as a social responsibility because we don't want to add our darkness to this collective shadow projection that's happening now.
I think that's a beautiful high ground to look at shadow work, because it is something that we can seize in our lives as part of our individuation, to examine ourselves and improve our lives and the lives around us. You write a lot about how shadow work sometimes, when it involves a romantic couple, a hetero couple, certainly not exclusive to hetero couples, but there, I was reading a research this morning about a study, I think it was done in 21 countries, about the relationship between women achieving things, women achieving education, women achieving equality in a country. And there were benchmarks set, and what's the reaction from their male counterparts. And what was most interesting was that the more equality women achieved, the more traditional the role the male preferred to play,
Yes.
which is the opposite. It sets up sort of that shadow dancing that you talk about.
Right.
So, what is it about relationships that makes them a hotbed for shadow?
Well, we're seeing that in our country now with the whole manosphere and the reactionary male response to feminism and women's empowerment. And it's tragic to me and scary because it's always been happening, but it's so vocal now with social media, right?
Yes.
So I'm not an expert on gender. There are other people who know a lot more about that, but I can talk about shadow in relationships. And I do think it applies to gay relationships as well. I don't think it's only about hetero relationships. So what happens is when we're dating and we meet someone and our heart's open, our imagination's open too. And we shoot an arrow of projection. Oh my God, that person is beautiful and smart and so unlike my mother or father. This is the person I've been looking for. And it can have some truth to it. It doesn't mean it's all false, but it's not based on knowing that person and his or her complexity and his or her issues. It's based on a quick, intuitive response, which is projection. And then what happens is that couple gets together and unknowingly, they both have this long bag of shadow characters that they've been building and carrying through their lives, right?
Yes, that's a Robert Bly.
That's Robert Bly.
Yes,
That's
the
his
long
image.
shadow.
And then they meet
Yeah.
and they think they're going to marry this whole person. But in fact, they haven't met all the shadow issues yet, because during the romantic cycle, most people are a bit in persona. They're not showing all their little moles and, hidden spots, right? Blemishes and moles. So they get married, and then a year later, they're going, what did I do? This isn't the person I married. He has a secret drinking problem, right? Or she has a secret history I didn't know about, or a secret criticism. She's always criticizing me, right? Or he's always withdrawing into himself, doesn't want to be with me, would rather be with his friends, or whatever the issue is. And so then the relationship gets real. This is not, from my point of view, the moment to run. From my point, and the divorce rate is over 60% in California. People don't have the tools. They don't have the practices. They don't even think about going to therapy, most people, right? So for me, this is when it begins. This is the beginning of the journey, not the end. And it entails really getting to know yourself at a deeper level. Why am I criticizing my husband every day? What he's wearing, or how he's eating, or whatever it is. And you begin to look, you using this method, you form a shadow character by identifying, what are you saying to yourself when you're critical? What are you feeling? What are the bodily sensations? And you give it a name, the critic, and you give it an image. So whenever it comes up, you can see it. And then you have these cues to begin to deal with this shadow figure that before was just abstract, amorphous, couldn't get a grip on it, right? Just slipped away. It came out and it slipped away again. So now you begin to work with the critic and try to detect the hidden message that it's giving you. And for many people, the consequence of criticizing your spouse is they withdraw. They're hurt and they close down. Maybe there's a part of you that wanted that response, wanted the distance, created distance unconsciously, whereas consciously what you really need is a little space.
Yes.
But you can't say it. You don't have the tools to make I statements. You know what? I want the day off today. I'm going to spend some time alone. I love you. I'll see you at 6:00. Instead, you go, oh my God, you're wearing that again? You're not brushing your teeth again? You're not brushing your hair? What's going on? You're late for work again? And then you get the distance. But you also get a lack of intimacy, a lack of contact, a lack of safety, because he's going to withdraw or she's going to withdraw. So each shadow character has a valid need. And when I discovered that, it kind of blew my mind. Because they form in these ways when we're really young with valid needs to protect us from something. So let's say the critic is hiding this valid need for space, but unconsciously you're creating this space with all these consequences. If you learn to actually recognize it before it acts out, right, before it criticizes, and you begin to take that space consciously, you have a different relationship. There's a different outcome.
Well, I'm also going to guess that once you start doing shadow work for yourself, it changes the dynamic for your spouse or your partner as well. It gives them room to examine themselves. And so there's a sort of trickle out effect that
Yeah.
this energy that was previously highly charged, because we talked about that, now it gets redirected in a way that is more constructive.
Because I'm accountable. It's no longer about what he's wearing. It's about my need for distance. I'm accountable for my shadow character. And then he can be accountable for his. Gee, I'm late for work again. I wonder why I'm doing that. And he can look at himself because he has the safety and the space to do that because there's no blame.
You've talked in several places in your writing about the saboteur, how the shadow can be our undoing. Let's go into that a little bit because I find it fascinating.
Okay. So in this case, the critic is sabotaging the intimacy of the relationship, right? But let's take another example. I had a client who came to me because she was eating ice cream every night and gaining weight. That was the presenting problem. And as we began to explore it, and I asked her, what are you thinking? What's your inner dialogue when you go to the fridge? What are you feeling? And what are your physical sensations? So she said she was thinking, if only I eat some ice cream, I can wait for my boyfriend to call because he's not calling. And I'm feeling kind of lonely and empty. And my body, my shoulders feel tight and my belly's kind of queasy. So now she had 3 cues of the shadow character. I said, let's give it a name. And she said, the foodie. And what does it look like? It's a big open mouth. Okay, so now she has all these dimensions. Jim Hillman used to talk about personification. So she's personifying the foodie. So she has an actual figure that she can relate to and dialogue with and find out about, right? And be responsible for, like we were saying. So as we're going through this process, a number of weeks go by and she's still eating the ice cream and she's recognizing the foodie. And at some point I said to her, I think it's time to call him. I can't bear the idea of being rejected by him. And so I said, okay, then you're going to live with the consequences of the foodie. No, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going to call him. So she calls him up and he says, I don't want a relationship with you, but I haven't been able to tell you. So she's devastated. And a few weeks go by and she's grieving the relationship. And in the next session, she says, I'm kind of relieved because now I know the truth. And I said to her, how do you think you learned this behavior of the foodie? And she said, well, my mother did it because my father always came home late. So she would eat, and she was scared to ask him where he was. Just like me, I was scared to ask him why he wasn't calling. And I said, okay, so the valid need of the foodie is to express yourself and share your needs. That's the gift of the foodie, that it's trying to tell you. If you continue to stuff those feelings, you'll continue to overeat.
So I can see in this how that was a brilliant segue to integration, because you can understand the logic of the foodie.
Yep.
You know now why you're doing it.
Yep.
You see how it's affecting you, and you understand that there's something really valid underneath it. And so then you can move forward. I mean, once you have consciousness, it's a, what did Carl Jung say? Every victory of consciousness is a defeat of the ego. And I can see very clearly how helpful that is.
And how to work with these self-sabotaging behaviors, because they have meaning. They have purpose. They have valid needs inside of them that they're trying to communicate with us, but we don't have the tools to, understand the unconscious. And it feels overwhelming. I mean, she was overwhelmed by her compulsion to go for the ice cream. So we had to go very slowly, step by step, recognize the cues, and recognize the consequences of continuing the behavior.
I didn't think I was going to ask you this, but I am wondering about this, just as a historical reference point. I've often wondered if, Carl Jung was working on shadow theory, and then Sigmund Freud started working on the death drive. And they're really two different ways of looking at an inherent sense of darkness that accompanies just being human. Do you know anything about that?
I kind of see the death drive differently. I think I wrote about this in Meeting the Shadow on the Spiritual Path. And I think it's connected to addiction. That there's a part of us that longs for what we think is annihilation, but is actually transcendence. It's ego death. It's not physical death. It's ego death.
And that's what we're after?
It's spiritual development. And again, we don't have the framework and we don't have the tools. And so we think it's a suicidal wish. But actually, and this is just my take on it, that it's actually the drive to transcend the ego that gets concretized or literalized in the death wish. When I wrote a novel about Rumi. I was kind of immersed in Rumi's verses. And during that time, there was a man in England who had written a little biography of Rumi. And I read that he had killed himself. And I thought, wow, he took, and what he said was, I'm going to join the beloved. So he literalized that wish to be one with the divine by thinking it was about death. And in some ways, I came to this because when Jung met with Bill W. and they talked about spirit and spirits, you remember that?
Yes.
And he kind of gave the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous this connection about longing for spirit and longing for spirits. And that's kind of where I got this idea from. And I think, and I can feel it in myself, and I could feel it in my clients. And I think Freud was, so against religion, he couldn't look at it as a spiritual longing. He could only look at it concretely.
Yes, and as a destructive force.
As a destructive force.
Builds its own entropy.
Right.
And then it becomes unleashed, as it were.
Right. Right. Yeah.
But I think both of them were probably responding to the world after major wars and seeing the wreckage in the humans who were showing up in their consulting rooms. And I think that's one of the reasons why shadow work is so optimistic, because it opens us to a different level of generation in our lives where we can be more generative, we've created space for that.
Well, sometimes when I teach creativity and shadow work, I call it the creative unconscious because it's the source of all creativity. This is the prima materia, Jung would call it, right?
Yes.
And so finding our way into the shadow, and it could be through creativity. It could be through, let's say, a creative block, a writer's block, or procrastination. There's a saboteur, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can't start the project or we can't complete the project. And so with shadow work, we learn how to explore why that's happening. And as you said, when you have awareness, you can make a different choice.
Yes.
So that's a whole other arena for this work. And I've posted my whole course on creativity and shadow work, both on my website, conniezweig.com, on my YouTube channel. People can find it if they're interested in it. There's a lot of free videos on my platforms. For people who are older, 50 and beyond, there are ways in which we specifically meet the shadow. In our inner ageist, in the doer that doesn't let us slow down. There are these shadow characters that are explored in the inner work of age, shifting from role to soul. And the purpose of the book is to kind of set up a rite of passage for people who are moving toward retirement or loss or illness and want to be doing shadow work and spiritual practice. There are lots of practices in the book.
We will actually link to some of those, Connie. This has been amazing. You and I could probably keep talking for another hour easily. You're fascinating. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining
Yes.
us here on Jung in the World today. Connie Zweig. I look forward to this getting out into the world.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2024 donors who gave at the contributor level or above. Barbara Anand, PhD in honor of Fred Maples, S.J., Uni Alcott, Judith and Eric Cooper, David Dalrymple, Mary Doherty, Full Bloom Lotus Center for Self-Awareness, Boris Matthews, Bruce G. and Mary A. Robert Family Foundation, Diane Sherwood, Lawrence C. Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, and the Blackbaud Giving Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.